Two racist cops corner a 73-year-old Vietnam veteran on a Brooklyn street, shoving the decorated soldier against a brick wall for no reason except the color of his skin. The officers laugh as they beat the frail man with nightsticks, ignoring his pleas and his veteran's ID card scattered on the pavement. But the powerful stranger watching from across the street isn't just another bystander. This is Mike Tyson himself, and these bullies just made the worst mistake of their pathetic careers. The crooked cops have no idea they're brutalizing a war hero in front of a man who's spent decades destroying anyone who hurts the innocent. While the veteran bleeds on the concrete, the former heavyweight champion approaches with that terrifying calm that made grown men tremble in the ring. The racist officers keep swinging their batons, thinking they're untouchable behind their badges, but they're actually about to learn why legends never really retire. Witnesses pull out their phones, expecting to film another police beating, but they're about to capture the moment two bullies meet their reckoning. What happens when you pick the wrong fight in front of Iron Mike? Will these corrupt cops survive, learning that some champions never stop defending the helpless? What happened next would haunt these thugs for the rest of their miserable lives. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the grease-stained windows of Mel's diner, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. In the corner booth, a powerfully built black man sat reading the newspaper, his broad shoulders filling out a simple button-down shirt. His presence commanded attention without effort. Other customers glanced his way, sensing something special about the quiet stranger, though they couldn't put their finger on what. Dolores Murphy wiped her hands on her apron and approached with the coffee pot. At 58, she'd seen every type of customer Brooklyn had to offer, but this one intrigued her. He carried himself with a calm confidence that reminded her of her late husband, a man who'd never started trouble but never backed down from it either. "More coffee, hon?" she asked, tilting the pot toward his cup. "Thank you, ma'am." His voice carried quiet authority, each word measured and deliberate. The distinctive lisp was subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to listen for. The man folded his newspaper carefully, revealing the front-page story about dismissed police brutality cases. His dark eyes scanned the article again, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Dolores noticed the way his thick fingers gripped the paper, hands that had clearly seen their share of work. "Terrible thing. What's happening in these neighborhoods?" Dolores said, nodding toward the headline. "Good people getting hurt, and nobody seems to care." The stranger looked up, his intense gaze meeting hers. "People care," he said softly. "Sometimes they just need someone to show them how to fight back the right way." At the counter, two construction workers debated loudly about whether anything would come of the latest investigation. A young mother hurried past their table, clutching her purse tighter as she noticed their heated discussion. The stranger's eyes followed her movement, taking in every detail of the small drama playing out in the diner. "You from around here?" Dolores asked, curiosity getting the better of her professional discretion. "Close enough," he replied, returning to his paper. "This neighborhood reminds me of where I grew up. Good people trying to live decent lives. But sometimes the wrong folks think they can take advantage." Dolores studied his profile as he read. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place it. The way he held himself, the careful way he spoke, like a man who'd learned to control tremendous power. She'd lived in this neighborhood long enough to recognize when someone dangerous walked through her door. But this man felt different. Dangerous, yes, but in the way a guard dog was dangerous, protective rather than predatory. The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered, and the stranger's eyes flicked up from his paper, cataloging the newcomer with practiced efficiency. His gaze lingered on the street beyond the window, watching the morning foot traffic with the attention of someone who missed nothing. 20 minutes later, the mysterious man still occupied his corner booth, though his newspaper lay forgotten beside his empty plate. His attention had shifted to the conversation at the counter, where Dolores was discussing the morning news with Eddie Kowalski, a retired postal worker who'd been coming to the diner for 15 years. "My nephew Randy's on the force," Eddie said, his voice carrying across the small space. "He says these brutality complaints are mostly garbage, troublemakers trying to get paid." The stranger's jaw tightened, his powerful hands resting motionless on the table. Dolores caught the subtle change in his posture, the way his shoulders squared almost imperceptibly. "That's not what I see," Dolores replied, refilling Eddie's cup. "Mrs. Patterson from down the block. Her boy got roughed up last month. Kid was walking home from basketball practice." "Different story when you hear the police version," Eddie insisted. "Randy says these kids mouth off, resist arrest. What do they expect?" The stranger rose from his booth with fluid grace, his movement catching everyone's attention despite its quiet nature. He approached the counter, pulling out his wallet with deliberate calm. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying enough authority to stop the conversation cold. "Couldn't help overhearing your discussion." Eddie turned, taking in the stranger's imposing presence. Something about the man's intense stare made the older postal worker shift uncomfortably on his stool. "You live around here," the stranger continued, his tone conversational but with an edge underneath. "Because I've seen what happens when good people look the other way. When folks decide that badges automatically make someone right." "Look, friend," Eddie started, but the stranger held up a hand. "I'm not looking for an argument," he said quietly. "Just sharing an observation. Sometimes the people with the most power are the ones who need watching the closest." He placed a 20 on the counter, enough to cover his meal and a generous tip. Dolores accepted it with a grateful nod, noting how the stranger's eyes never left Eddie's face. "Your nephew Randy," the stranger said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Maybe remind him that real strength comes from protecting people, not pushing them around." The intensity in his voice made Eddie's face pale. The retired postal worker mumbled something about being late for an appointment and hurried toward the door. "Don't mind Eddie," Dolores said after he left. "His nephew's got him convinced all cops are saints." The stranger's expression softened as he looked at her. People believe what they need to believe, until they see something that forces them to face the truth. He headed for the door, then paused. "You take care of yourself, Miss Dolores. And if you ever see trouble in this neighborhood, real trouble, don't be afraid to call for help." As he stepped onto the sidewalk, Dolores watched through the window. The man moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the street with the awareness of someone who understood both danger and justice. She had the strange feeling she'd just met someone important, though she still couldn't place where she might have seen him before. 3 blocks away, Franklin, Washington emerged from Martinez Corner Market, a small bag of groceries in his weathered hands. At 73, the decorated Vietnam veteran still carried himself with military bearing, though his steps moved slower than they had in his younger days. His silver star and purple heart weren't visible beneath his pressed cardigan, but the pride in his posture spoke of a man who'd served his country with honor. The morning sun felt good on his face as he made his way down the familiar sidewalk. This neighborhood had been his home for 40 years, through good times and bad. He'd watched families grow up, seen businesses come and go, and witnessed the slow erosion of respect that seemed to plague too many communities these days. Frank paused at the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. His mind drifted to his son Marcus, as it often did during these quiet morning walks. 3 years since the boy's death, and the official story still felt like salt in an old wound. 28 years old, found hanging in his jail cell after a routine traffic stop had somehow escalated into resisting arrest charges. Suicide, the report had said. Frank knew better. The light changed, and he continued his careful progress down the street. Behind him, a patrol car made a slow turn onto his block. Frank didn't notice at first, focused as he was on navigating the uneven sidewalk with his aging knees. It wasn't until he heard the car door slam that he looked back. 2 young officers approached him, their swagger immediately putting Frank on edge. He developed an instinct for reading situations during his 2 tours in Vietnam, and everything about these men screamed trouble. "Excuse me, sir," the taller officer called out. His name tag read Kowalski, and his cold gray eyes held no respect for the elderly man before him. "We need to speak with you." Frank stopped, setting his grocery bag down carefully. "Good morning, officers. How can I help you?" Officer Randy Kowalski looked Frank up and down with obvious disdain. His partner, Dale Brennan, hung back slightly, nervous energy radiating from his smaller frame. Both men were young enough to be Frank's grandsons, but their attitudes suggested they'd learned all the wrong lessons about authority. "You match the description of a robbery suspect," Kowalski said, his tone already aggressive. Black male, elderly, carrying a bag. Frank's eyebrows rose. Officer, that's a pretty broad description. I'm 73 years old, and I just bought groceries from Martinez's market. Mr. Martinez can vouch for me. Nobody asked for your life story, old man. Brennan chimed in, trying to sound tougher than his nervous demeanor suggested. Just show us some ID. Frank reached slowly into his pocket, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He'd learned long ago that any sudden motion around hostile authority figures could escalate a situation beyond control. His fingers found his wallet, and he carefully withdrew his driver's license and veteran's identification card. Here you go, Frank said, extending the documents with steady hands. As you can see, I'm Franklin Washington, a decorated veteran, and 40-year resident of this neighborhood. Kowalski barely glanced at the IDs before handing them back roughly. Doesn't matter what these say. We still need to search you. Frank's military training kicked in as he assessed the deteriorating situation. These officers had no legitimate reason for a search, and their aggressive posture suggested they were looking for trouble rather than preventing it. He'd seen this scenario play out too many times in his neighborhood, always ending badly for the victim. Officers, I understand you have a job to do, Frank said calmly, but I know my rights. You have no probable cause for a search. Kowalski's face darkened at the challenge to his authority. Listen here, you old piece of… He caught himself, glancing around at the few pedestrians who'd stopped to watch. We'll determine what constitutes probable cause. This is harassment, Frank said, his voice remaining steady despite the danger he sensed approaching. I'm a decorated Vietnam veteran, and I demand to be treated with the respect any citizen deserves. Vietnam. Brennan laughed harshly. That was like 50 years ago, Grandpa. Nobody cares about your ancient history. The insult hit Frank harder than a physical blow. He'd heard similar disrespect from young people before, but never from men, wearing badges and sworn to protect. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the proud soldier who'd charged enemy positions in the jungle flickered in his tired eyes. That ancient history is why you have the freedom to wear that uniform, Frank said quietly. Kowalski stepped closer, his intimidation tactics shifting into high gear. You getting smart with me? Maybe we need to take a closer look at what you're really up to. Frank felt the familiar weight of injustice settling on his shoulders. This was how it started. Arbitrary stops, manufactured suspicion, escalating confrontation. He'd documented enough cases over the past 3 years to recognize the pattern. Young officers drunk on power, targeting elderly black men who couldn't fight back effectively. I'm not looking for trouble, Frank said, taking a small step backward. I just want to go home. Too late for that, Kowalski said, moving to block Frank's retreat. You should have been more cooperative from the start. Brennan positioned himself on Frank's other side, completing the trap. A few more pedestrians had stopped to watch, but Frank knew from experience that witnesses rarely intervened when police were involved. People were too afraid of becoming targets themselves that Frank's grocery bag trembled slightly in his grip as he realized how quickly the situation had spiraled beyond his control. These weren't officers interested in justice or public safety. They were predators who'd found an easy target, and there was nowhere to run. Please, Frank said, his dignity intact despite the fear creeping into his voice. I haven't done anything wrong. Kowalski's smile was cold and cruel. We'll be the judge of that, old man. The veteran closed his eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer for strength and protection. When he opened them again, he saw Kowalski's hand moving toward his nightstick, and Frank knew his long walk home was about to become something much worse. The first blow came without warning. Kowalski's palm struck Frank's chest, sending the elderly veteran stumbling backward toward the brick wall of Romano's bakery. The grocery bag fell from Frank's hands, apples rolling across the sidewalk as he struggled to maintain his balance. Stop, Frank called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd once led soldiers into battle. This is assault. But his words only seemed to enrage Kowalski further. The young officer grabbed Frank by the front of his cardigan and slammed him against the rough brick wall. Frank's head struck the surface with a dull thud, sending sharp pain through his skull. Shut your mouth, old man, Kowalski snarled, his face inches from Frank's. You want to play lawyer? Let's see how smart you are now. Brennan fumbled for his nightstick, his nervous energy finally finding an outlet. "Randy, maybe we should." "Should? What?" Kowalski snapped, not taking his eyes off Frank. "This piece of garbage thinks he can lecture us about respect. Time he learned who's really in charge around here." Frank tried to push himself away from the wall, but Kowalski's grip was too strong. The younger man's fingers dug into the fabric of Frank's cardigan, and the veteran could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath. Around them, the handful of witnesses took instinctive steps backward, their faces showing the universal fear of civilians caught between authority and violence. "I served my country," Frank said quietly, trying one last appeal to whatever humanity these men might possess. "I fought for freedom and justice. This isn't what America is supposed to be." Kowalski's response was a vicious shove that sent Frank's back crashing into the wall again. This time, the impact knocked the wind from the old man's lungs, leaving him gasping for breath. "Your country." Kowalski laughed harshly. "This is our neighborhood now, Grandpa. We decide what justice looks like." Brennan raised his nightstick, the polished wood gleaming in the morning sun. Frank saw the weapon coming and tried to raise his hands in defense, but decades of arthritis and the awkward position against the wall left him helpless. The first strike caught him across the forearm, sending white-hot pain shooting through his elbow. Frank cried out, the sound echoing off the buildings around them. The witnesses on the sidewalk gasped collectively, but none moved to intervene. "Please," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm an old man. I haven't done anything wrong." Kowalski's smile was pure malice. "Wrong place, wrong time, wrong attitude. Sometimes that's all it takes." The nightstick fell again, this time catching Frank across the ribs. The veteran doubled over, his breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. Brennan's nervousness had transformed into something uglier, the excitement of a coward finally finding someone weaker to hurt. "That's for running your mouth," Brennan said, raising the weapon for another strike. Frank tried to cover his head with his arms, but Kowalski grabbed his wrists and pinned them against the brick wall. The rough surface scraped against Frank's palms, drawing thin lines of blood. He was completely defenseless now, a 73-year-old man trapped between two armed officers who seemed determined to teach him a lesson in submission. "My son," Frank gasped, thinking of Marcus. "You killed my son, and now." The words were cut off as Brennan's nightstick caught him across the shoulder blade. Pain exploded through Frank's back, and he sagged against the wall, held upright only by Kowalski's grip on his wrists. Around them, the crowd of witnesses had grown larger, but their faces showed only horror and helplessness. Mrs. Chun from the flower shop stood frozen on the sidewalk, her hand pressed to her mouth. Two teenagers with backpacks watched in stunned silence, their phones in their hands, but seemingly forgotten. "Somebody help him," one of the kids whispered, but the words carried no conviction. Everyone knew the unspoken rule: you didn't interfere with police business, no matter how wrong it looked. Kowalski leaned close to Frank's ear, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "Your boy Marcus was a troublemaker too. Some people never learn when to keep their mouths shut." The mention of his dead son sent rage flooding through Frank's battered body. Despite his age and injuries, the old soldier tried to push back against his tormentor. For a moment, 40 years fell away, and he was once again Sergeant Franklin Washington, leading his squad through enemy territory, but his body betrayed him. The surge of adrenaline lasted only seconds before exhaustion and pain dragged him back to reality. He was just an elderly man being brutalized by two officers who seemed to enjoy their work. Brennan raised his nightstick again, aiming for Frank's head this time. The veteran closed his eyes, bracing for the blow that might end everything. He thought of his wife Margaret, gone 5 years now, and wondered if he'd see her again soon. "That's enough entertainment," Kowalski said, his voice carrying casual cruelty. "Time to finish this lesson." Frank heard footsteps approaching from across the street, but he didn't dare hope. People had been watching for minutes without helping. Why would anyone step in now? The nightstick began its downward arc toward Frank's skull. The old veteran offered a silent prayer and prepared for darkness. Then a voice cut through the morning air like thunder. "Hey, get off that old man." The voice carried unmistakable authority, freezing Brennan's nightstick in mid-swing. Both officers turned toward the sound, their confidence faltering for the first time since the confrontation began. Across the street, the powerful figure they dismissed as another bystander was striding toward them with purposeful determination. Even from a distance, the man's presence was overwhelming. His broad shoulders and thick neck spoke of devastating physical power, while his measured pace suggested absolute confidence in his ability to handle whatever came next. The witnesses on the sidewalk seemed to sense something momentous approaching. "Mind your own business," Kowalski called out, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Something about the approaching stranger made his hand drift instinctively toward his service weapon. The man stepped under the clear morning light, and several witnesses gasped in recognition. That distinctive facial tattoo, those intense dark eyes, the unmistakable build of a legendary fighter. There was no mistaking who stood before them. "The name's Mike Tyson," he said quietly, his famous lisp adding weight to each word rather than diminishing it. "And you just made a big mistake." Kowalski's face went pale as the implications hit him. Brennan's nightstick trembled in his grip, suddenly feeling inadequate against the man who'd once been the most feared fighter on the planet. This wasn't some random citizen they could intimidate. This was Iron Mike himself, and they'd just brutalized an elderly veteran in front of him. "This is police business," Kowalski said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Walk away, and nobody gets hurt." Tyson's response was a cold smile that had once terrorized heavyweight contenders around the world. "Nobody gets hurt? You already hurt somebody, kid. Now it's time to learn about consequences." The former champion moved closer with fluid grace, his hands loose at his sides but ready for devastation. Frank, still pinned against the wall, felt a surge of hope for the first time since the beating began. He recognized the look in Tyson's eyes, the same focused intensity he'd seen in soldiers who decided that enough was enough. "You have 3 seconds to step away from that man," Tyson said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 1. Brennan raised his nightstick, trying to look threatening despite the fear obvious in his trembling hands. Kowalski reached for his radio, probably intending to call for backup. 2. The tension in the air was electric. The witnesses held their breath, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. Even the morning traffic seemed to slow. As drivers caught glimpses of the confrontation, Kowalski made his choice, lunging forward with his nightstick raised. "You're under arrest for interfering with." He never finished the sentence. Tyson moved with the explosive speed that had made him legend. His right hand shot out in a devastating uppercut that caught Kowalski beneath the chin, lifting the younger man clean off his feet. The impact sounded like a baseball bat hitting concrete, and Kowalski crumpled to the sidewalk, unconscious before he hit the ground. Brennan swung his nightstick desperately, but might as well have been moving in slow motion. Tyson slipped the clumsy attack with practiced ease, then delivered a left hook that caught the officer in the solar plexus. Brennan doubled over, gasping for air, just as Tyson's right hand found his jaw with surgical precision. The entire confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds. Both officers lay motionless on the sidewalk, their weapons scattered uselessly around them. Tyson stood over them for a moment, his breathing barely elevated, looking down at the unconscious men with something between contempt and pity. "Some people never learn," he said quietly, then turned his attention to Frank. The elderly veteran was sliding down the brick wall, his legs no longer able to support him. Tyson moved quickly to his side, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he helped Frank find his footing. "Easy, soldier," Tyson said, his voice filled with respect. "You're safe now." Frank looked up into the champion's eyes, seeing kindness beneath the legendary intensity. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the beating. I thought they were going to kill me." "Not on my watch," Tyson replied firmly. He pulled out his phone, dialing 911 with one hand, while keeping the other steady on Frank's shoulder. "I need an ambulance and honest cops at the corner of 5th and Martinez Street. Elderly gentleman needs medical attention, and we have 2 officers down." Around them, the witnesses were finally finding their voices and their phones. Several people were recording everything, while others called their own emergency contacts. The teenage boys who'd watched in helpless horror were now documenting every angle of the unconscious officers. "Make sure you get good footage," Tyson called to them. "This old man is a decorated veteran, and everyone needs to see how these cowards treated him." As sirens began wailing in the distance, Tyson's expression darkened. Something about Kowalski's face was nagging at him. Where had he seen this officer before? Then it hit him like one of his own punches. The newspaper article he'd been reading at the diner, the dismissed brutality cases, the photo of officers who'd walked free despite overwhelming evidence. Randy Kowalski had been in that article. This wasn't random police misconduct. This was part of something bigger, something organized. And that meant Frank Washington wasn't the first victim, and he wouldn't be the last unless someone with enough power and determination decided to fight back. The ambulance rounded the corner just as Kowalski began stirring consciousness. Tyson looked down at the groaning officer, then at Frank's battered face, and made a decision that would change everything. "This ends now," he said quietly, but his words carried the weight of an oath. The sterile smell of disinfectant couldn't mask the underlying tension in Brooklyn Methodist Hospital's emergency ward. Mike Tyson sat quietly in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Frank Washington's bed, his imposing frame making the furniture look like children's toys. The elderly veteran lay propped up against pillows, his left arm in a sling and dark bruises coloring his weathered face. "You didn't have to come," Frank said, though gratitude filled his voice. "I know you must have important things to do." Tyson leaned forward, his intense eyes studying the old man's injuries. "Nothing more important than making sure you're okay, soldier. Besides, I've been in enough hospitals to know how lonely they can get." Frank managed a weak smile. "You saved my life out there. Those boys would have beaten me to death if you hadn't stepped in." "Those weren't boys," Tyson said quietly. "Those were cowards with badges. There's a difference." The two men sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each recognizing something familiar in the other. Both had faced their share of battles, Frank in the jungles of Vietnam, Tyson in rings around the world and courtrooms afterward. Both understood what it meant to be judged, dismissed, and underestimated. "Can I ask you something?" Frank said, his voice growing stronger. "What made you step in? Most people just walk away when they see trouble." Tyson was quiet for a long moment, his thick fingers drumming against his knee. "I've been on the wrong side of power before," he said finally. "Spent time in places where strong men hurt weak ones just because they could. Promised myself I'd never stand by and watch it happen again." Frank nodded slowly. "You know, this wasn't the first time those officers caused trouble in our neighborhood. I've been keeping track." "Keeping track?" Tyson's interest sharpened. Frank gestured toward the small duffel bag on the bedside table. "Documentation. Photos. Witness statements. Complaint numbers. Been doing it for 3 years now, ever since." His voice trailed off. "Ever since what?" Tyson asked gently. Frank's eyes grew distant, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of profound loss. "Ever since they killed my son Marcus." The words hit Tyson like a physical blow. He'd sensed deeper pain in the old man, but this revelation explained everything. The careful documentation, the refusal to back down despite his age, the determination to stand up for his rights even when facing violent officers. "Tell me," Tyson said simply. Frank took a shaky breath. "Marcus was 28. Good boy, worked at the community center, helped kids stay out of trouble. One night, routine traffic stop turned into resisting arrest charges. Found him hanging in his cell 3 hours later. Suicide." Tyson's voice carried disbelief. "That's what they called it." Frank's jaw tightened. But Marcus had plans. Girlfriend he was going to propose to. New job starting the next week. And the autopsy. Frank shook his head. "Injuries. That didn't match hanging. But the investigation got buried. Case closed. Everyone moved on except me." Tyson felt familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to demolish opponents in the ring. But this was different, colder, more focused. This wasn't about personal glory or championship belts. This was about justice for a grieving father and a murdered son. "Show me," he said quietly. Frank reached for his duffel bag with his good arm, wincing at the movement. Tyson helped him retrieve a thick manila folder stuffed with papers, photographs, and newspaper clippings. The organization was meticulous. Dates, times, officer badge numbers, witness contact information. 3 years of work, Frank said, spreading some of the documents across his hospital blanket. 47 incidents of excessive force, 18 suspicious arrests, 12 complaints that disappeared from official records. Tyson studied the materials with growing amazement. Frank had created a comprehensive case file that would make FBI investigators proud. Photos of bruised faces, copies of medical records, detailed timelines of events, all organized with military precision. "This is incredible," Tyson said. "Why haven't you taken this to the authorities?" Frank's laugh was bitter. "Which authorities? The police? They're the ones doing it. Internal affairs? They buried my son's case. The district attorney? He plays golf with the precinct captain. What about the FBI? Federal prosecutors? Tried that too." Frank pulled out a letter from the stack. "Thank you for your concern, but local law enforcement matters fall under state jurisdiction. If you have evidence of federal crimes, please contact your local FBI field office." Local FBI field office says it's a matter for internal affairs. Tyson felt the familiar sensation of being trapped in a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the powerless. He'd experienced it during his own legal troubles, but this was worse. Frank was fighting not just for himself, but for his dead son and countless other victims. "There's something else," Frank said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The officer who beat me today, Randy Kowalski. His name's in my files." Frank flipped through several pages until he found what he was looking for. A police report from 18 months ago involving a domestic dispute that had escalated into assault charges against the victim. College student named Jerome Williams called for help when his neighbor was beating his girlfriend. When police arrived, somehow Jerome ended up arrested for disorderly conduct and assault on an officer. Spent 6 months in jail because he couldn't make bail. Tyson studied the report, noting Kowalski's signature at the bottom. Same pattern. Exactly. Young black men who should be getting help instead get arrested. Old black men who know their rights get beaten. And it all gets covered up by their supervisors. Frank leaned back against his pillows, exhaustion evident in his lined face. "I've been documenting everything, hoping someday someone with enough power would care enough to listen. Someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought off." Tyson looked at the older man with new respect. Here was a 73-year-old veteran who'd been conducting a one-man investigation into police corruption, motivated by love for his dead son and determination to protect his community. "Well, you found someone," Tyson said firmly. "And I promise you this, those badges won't protect them from what's coming." The knock on Frank's hospital room door came at exactly 8 o'clock that evening. Both men looked up as a woman in her early 40s entered, her professional attire and confident bearing immediately identifying her as law enforcement. She was attractive but serious, with sharp green eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the room. "Mr. Tyson? Mr. Washington?" She closed the door behind her and approached cautiously. "My name is Detective Lieutenant Patricia Romano. I need to speak with you both about what happened this morning." Tyson tensed, his protective instincts flaring. "If you're here to cover for those animals who beat up this old man." "I'm not," she interrupted firmly. "I'm here because I've been waiting 3 years for someone like you to get involved." Frank and Tyson exchanged glances. Something in her tone suggested this wasn't a routine follow-up interview. Romano pulled out her badge and ID, setting them on Frank's bedside table. "I'm with Internal Affairs, but I'm also working with a federal task force investigating corruption in this precinct. What happened to you today, Mr. Washington, is part of a much larger problem." "Federal task force?" Frank sat up straighter despite his injuries. "FBI Public Corruption Unit," Romano confirmed. "We've been building a case for 2 years, but we've needed someone with enough profile and credibility to bring national attention to what's happening here." Tyson leaned forward. "You're saying this was planned?" "Not the specific incident," Romano clarified. "But officers like Kowalski and Brennan have been operating with impunity for years. They target elderly residents, people who can't fight back effectively, knowing their complaints won't be taken seriously." She gestured toward Frank's folder of documentation. "Mr. Washington, your son Marcus wasn't the first suspicious death in custody, and the pattern of excessive force complaints has been escalating. We believe there's an organized effort within the precinct to intimidate certain communities." Frank's grip tightened on his folder. "Organized by who?" Romano's expression darkened. "Captain Vincent Torino, 30-year veteran with connections throughout city government. He's built a network of officers who share his perspectives on law enforcement. Meaning, Tyson's voice carried dangerous undertones, meaning they believe certain people deserve different treatment under the law. And when complaints arise, Captain Torino has enough political influence to make them disappear. Romano pulled out her own folder, considerably thicker than Frank's. We have evidence of witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and systematic cover-ups. But every time we get close to filing charges, key evidence vanishes or witnesses recant their statements. Tyson studied the detective's face, his instincts telling him she was legitimate. Why come to us? If you're federal, you don't need our permission to investigate. Because investigation isn't enough anymore, Romano said bluntly. We need exposure, national media attention, pressure from outside the local power structure. Your involvement today changes everything. Suddenly, this isn't just another brutality complaint that can be buried. Romano opened her folder and spread several photographs across Frank's hospital table. Surveillance photos, crime scene images, and what appeared to be internal police documents marked with evidence tags. This is what we're really dealing with, she said. Captain Torino doesn't just cover up misconduct, he actively encourages it. Officers who follow his methods get promoted, choice assignments, overtime opportunities. Those who question his approach find themselves transferred or forced out. Frank picked up one of the surveillance photos showing a group of officers in what appeared to be a social setting. How many are involved? At least 24 across 3 precincts, Romano replied. But Torino's the head of the snake. Take him down, and the whole network collapses. Tyson studied an internal memo bearing Torino's signature. The language was carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. Certain communities required enhanced enforcement techniques to maintain order. This is organized racism with badges, Tyson said quietly. Exactly. And it's been going on for years because Torino has protected his people. He's got judges who owe him favors, politicians who need his support, media contacts who spike unfavorable stories. Romano pulled out a newspaper clipping from 6 months ago, a small item buried on page 7 about dismissed charges against 3 officers accused of brutality. Every time we think we have a solid case, something happens. Witnesses develop sudden memory problems. Evidence gets misfiled. Prosecutors discover procedural errors that invalidate arrests. Frank's voice was heavy with recognition. Just like with Marcus. Your son's case was textbook Torino, Romano confirmed. The original investigating detective found significant evidence suggesting homicide. Then he was transferred to another precinct. The case was reassigned, and the new detective concluded suicide within 48 hours. The room fell silent as the full scope of the corruption became clear. This wasn't just a few bad cops. It was a systematic operation designed to protect certain officers while targeting vulnerable communities. So what's changed? Tyson asked. Why can you move now when you couldn't before? Romano smiled grimly. Because this morning, Iron Mike Tyson knocked out 2 corrupt cops in front of a dozen witnesses with cell phone cameras. By tonight, that footage will be on every news channel in America. Torino can't make this disappear. She gathered her photos back into the folder. But he's going to try. Right now, he's probably working his contacts, preparing counter-narratives, maybe even planning to have you arrested on assault charges. Tyson's eyes hardened. Let him try. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Romano said. Because we're going to need your help to finish this. The federal case is solid, but we need someone who can't be intimidated or bought off to help us bring it into the light. Frank reached across the table to grip Tyson's arm with his uninjured hand. My boy Marcus, all those other victims, they deserve justice. Tyson looked at the elderly veteran, then at the determined detective, and felt the familiar surge of purpose that had once driven him to championship glory. But this fight was bigger than any title bout he'd ever faced. Then, let's give them justice, he said quietly. All of them. The community center on Prospect Avenue hadn't seen this many people since the neighborhood Christmas pageant 3 years ago. Folding chairs filled every available space, with overflow crowds standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. The air buzzed with nervous energy as residents who rarely spoke to each other found themselves united by shared experiences of injustice. Mike Tyson stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding attention without effort. Beside him, Frank Washington sat in a wheelchair, his arms still in a sling, but his eyes bright with determination. Detective Romano had suggested the meeting, but it was Tyson's celebrity that filled the seats. Most of you know why we're here. Tyson began, his voice carrying easily through the packed room. 3 days ago, I watched two police officers beat up a decorated Vietnam veteran for no reason except the color of his skin. But after talking with Mr. Washington and others, I've learned this isn't an isolated incident. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Tyson recognized faces from his morning walks through the neighborhood. Shopkeepers, retirees, young mothers, teenagers who should have been preparing for college instead of worrying about police harassment. I want to hear your stories, Tyson continued. Not just about what happened to you, but about what's been happening to all of us. Because the only way to stop this is to bring it into the light. An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand tentatively. Mr. Tyson, what if they come after us for speaking up? They've already been coming after you, Frank answered before Tyson could respond. My son Marcus tried to stay quiet, tried not to make waves. They killed him anyway. The stark truth of Frank's words silenced the room. Then, slowly, hands began to rise. Maria Santos stood first, her voice shaking but determined. My nephew, Diego, he's 16. Walking home from school last month, 3 officers stopped him, said he matched a robbery description. They searched him, pushed him around, called him names I won't repeat in front of children. Where did this happen? Tyson asked. 2 blocks from here, corner of 5th and Martinez. Frank pulled out a small notebook from his pocket. I've got 6 other incidents at that same corner in the past year. One by one, other stories emerged. Jerome Williams, the college student from Frank's files, talked about spending 6 months in jail for trying to help a domestic violence victim. Mrs. Chun described watching officers harass customers outside her flower shop. A young mother named Keisha told about being threatened with arrest for questioning why police had detained her 12-year-old son. Each story followed the same pattern: aggressive stops, manufactured charges, intimidation of anyone who complained. And in every case, the complaints had been dismissed or ignored by higher authorities. This is what systematic oppression looks like, Tyson said after the last story was told. It's not one bad apple. It's an organized effort to terrorize this community. The crowd murmured agreement, but their faces still showed fear mixed with anger. So what do we do? Asked Jerome Williams. That Tyson's smile was grim but determined. We fight back, but we do it smart, and we do it together. The next morning brought a media circus to the quiet Brooklyn neighborhood. News vans lined the streets outside Frank Washington's modest row house, their satellite dishes reaching toward cloudy skies like technological flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters clutched coffee cups and checked their equipment while cameramen tested angles and lighting. Inside Frank's living room, Tyson sat beside the elderly veteran as they prepared for their first major television interview. CNN had sent their top investigative reporter, and the segment was scheduled to air during the evening news. You nervous? Tyson asked, adjusting Frank's tie with surprisingly gentle hands. Scared to death, Frank admitted. But Marcus deserves to have his story told. The reporter, Sandra Mitchell, was a seasoned professional who'd covered corruption cases across the country. She set up her questions with surgical precision, building from the specific incident to the broader pattern of abuse. Mr. Washington, she began, you've been documenting police misconduct in this neighborhood for 3 years. What initially motivated you to start this investigation? Frank looked directly into the camera. My son Marcus was murdered in police custody. The official report called it suicide, but a father knows his child. Marcus had everything to live for, and the evidence didn't match their story. And Mr. Tyson, what compelled you to intervene when you witnessed Mr. Washington being beaten? Tyson leaned forward, his intensity translating powerfully on camera. I've seen what happens when good people stay silent while bullies abuse their power. Sometimes you have to be willing to fight back, even if it costs you something. The interview aired that evening to national attention. By morning, the story had spread across social media, with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #IronMike versus Corruption trending worldwide. Support poured in from celebrities, civil rights organizations, and ordinary citizens who recognized the broader implications of the story. More importantly, other victims found their courage. The neighborhood community center became an unofficial headquarters where people shared their experiences with police misconduct. Detective Romano worked quietly behind the scenes, collecting sworn statements and building cases that couldn't be dismissed. Local news stations picked up the story, and suddenly Captain Torino found himself facing questions he couldn't deflect. Press conferences became uncomfortable affairs where reporters asked pointed questions about excessive force complaints and mysterious evidence disappearances. Frank became the face of the movement, his dignity and military service making him an impossible target for character assassination. When he spoke about his son Marcus, even hardened reporters found themselves moved by his quiet pain and determination. "This isn't about revenge," Frank told a packed press conference. "This is about making sure no other parent has to go through what I've been through. No other family should have to bury a child because some officers think badges make them above the law." The momentum seemed unstoppable. Politicians who had previously ignored police brutality complaints suddenly called for investigations. The mayor announced the formation of a civilian oversight committee. Even police union representatives began distancing themselves from officers with extensive complaint histories. For the first time in 3 years, Frank Washington allowed himself to hope that justice might finally be within reach. 3 weeks after the community meeting, the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for finally came. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez stood behind a podium bristling with microphones, her expression grave but determined as she faced the assembled media. "After a thorough investigation, my office is filing criminal charges against Officers Randy Kowalski and Dale Brennan for assault, battery, and deprivation of civil rights under color of authority," she announced. "Additional charges are pending against other members of the precinct as our investigation continues." The crowd gathered outside the courthouse erupted in cheers. Frank Washington, still using a cane but no longer confined to a wheelchair, wiped tears from his eyes as supporters surrounded him with congratulations. Tyson stood slightly apart from the celebration, his expression cautiously optimistic. "This is just the beginning," DA Martinez continued. "We are also announcing a comprehensive review of all excessive force complaints filed against the 5th Precinct over the past 5 years. Any cases involving suspicious circumstances will be reopened and thoroughly investigated." The questions from reporters came fast and pointed. Yes, Captain Torino was under investigation. Yes, they were examining potential evidence tampering. Yes, they had cooperated fully with federal authorities throughout the process. Detective Romano watched from the back of the crowd, satisfaction evident on her face. The federal case was proceeding exactly as planned, with local prosecutors finally showing the courage to act on evidence that had been ignored for years. That evening, the neighborhood celebrated. Dolores Murphy opened her diner for a community gathering, serving coffee and pie while people shared stories and hope for the future. For the first time in memory, the conversation wasn't dominated by fear of police harassment. "You did it," Maria Santos told Frank, her teenage nephew Diego, standing proudly beside her. "You actually did it." Frank shook his head gently. "We all did it. Every person who found the courage to speak up, every witness who came forward. This victory belongs to all of us." Tyson found himself surrounded by community members wanting to shake his hand and thank him for his intervention. Children who had once feared walking to school alone now looked at him with admiration, seeing proof that someone would stand up for them when needed. "Mr. Tyson," a young boy asked, "are the bad police going to jail now?" "Some of them are," Tyson replied carefully. "And the good police are going to make sure this doesn't happen again." The celebration continued late into the evening, with people reluctant to let go of their first taste of justice in years. Even Detective Romano stopped by briefly, offering quiet congratulations to Frank and Tyson before disappearing back into the shadows of her ongoing investigation. For one perfect night, it seemed like the system had finally worked the way it was supposed to. Good had triumphed over evil, courage had defeated corruption, and a community had found its voice. None of them could have predicted how quickly everything would fall apart. The devastating news came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a grim-faced Detective Romano who knocked on Frank's door before sunrise. Her usually composed demeanor was shattered, replaced by barely controlled rage and something that looked like defeat. "The video evidence from the beating is gone," she said without preamble. "Every copy, every backup, mysteriously corrupted or lost." Frank felt his coffee cup slip from his fingers, the ceramic shattering on his kitchen floor. What do you mean, gone? I mean, someone with high-level access systematically destroyed every piece of video evidence we had. The witness recordings, from cell phones, security camera footage from nearby businesses, even the body cam footage that supposedly malfunctioned, all of it. Tyson, who had been staying in Frank's guest room since the threat started, emerged from the hallway with dangerous fury building in his eyes. How does that happen by accident? It doesn't, Romano said flatly. This was professional, coordinated, and thorough. Whoever did this had help from inside the system. Worse news followed throughout the morning. 3 key witnesses suddenly developed amnesia about what they'd seen during the beating. Mrs. Chun, who had given a detailed statement about watching Kowalski attack Frank, now claimed she'd been inside her shop and seen nothing. The teenagers who had filmed everything said their phones had been stolen and they couldn't remember any details. By noon, the devastating coup de grace arrived. Captain Torino held his own press conference, flanked by police union representatives and what appeared to be newly discovered witnesses. We have credible testimony that Mr. Tyson attacked officers Kowalski and Brennan without provocation, Torino announced, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in uniform. These officers were conducting a routine investigation when they were brutally assaulted by an individual with a documented history of violence. The witnesses were clean-cut men who claimed to have seen the entire incident from a coffee shop across the street. According to their sworn statements, Frank Washington had been cooperating fully with police when Tyson approached and immediately began attacking the officers. Mr. Washington was never struck or mistreated, one witness testified. The officers were professional throughout the encounter until they were attacked. The media reversal was swift and devastating. Without video evidence to contradict the new narrative, news outlets began questioning their earlier reporting. Legal experts pointed out that assault on police officers carried serious federal penalties, especially for someone with Tyson's history. By evening, federal marshals arrived at Frank's house with an arrest warrant. Mike Tyson surrendered peacefully, his hands cuffed behind his back as news cameras captured every moment. The charges were severe: assault on federal officers, conspiracy to incite civil unrest, and intimidation of witnesses. Frank watched helplessly from his doorway as they led Tyson away. The champion's last words echoed in the evening air. "Don't give up, soldier. This isn't over." But as the patrol car disappeared into the night, taking with it their best hope for justice, Frank Washington felt the familiar weight of a system designed to protect itself at any cost. The celebration of 3 weeks ago felt like a distant dream, replaced by the bitter reality that some fights could never be won by good intentions alone. In the shadows across the street, Captain Torino watched the arrest with cold satisfaction. His network had survived another challenge, and this time, they'd sent a message that would echo far beyond Brooklyn. Even legends could be destroyed if they threatened the wrong people. The corruption was stronger than ever, and now it had a very public victory to prove its power. The federal holding facility in downtown Brooklyn felt like a concrete tomb. Mike Tyson sat on the narrow bench in his cell, staring at walls that had contained countless men who'd learned the hard way that the system protected its own. The charges against him were serious enough to put him away for 15 years, and his lawyer's grim expression during their morning meeting had made the reality clear. The prosecution's case is stronger than we anticipated, attorney David Kellerman had explained, his expensive suit unable to mask his pessimism. Without video evidence to support your version of events, it becomes your word against multiple police officers and civilian witnesses. Tyson understood the mathematics of injustice. A black man with a criminal history attacking white police officers. The narrative wrote itself, regardless of the truth. The media had already begun shifting their coverage, questioning whether the legendary boxer had simply reverted to his violent past when confronted with authority. 3 blocks away, Frank Washington sat in his doctor's office receiving news almost as devastating as Tyson's arrest. Dr. Patricia Nguyen studied his latest test results with obvious concern, her usually optimistic demeanor replaced by clinical worry. "Your blood pressure is dangerously elevated, and these stress indicators suggest your body is struggling to cope," she said gently. "Mr. Washington, I need you to understand. At your age, This level of sustained stress could trigger a heart attack or stroke. Frank nodded slowly, feeling every one of his 73 years weighing on his shoulders. The beating had aggravated old war injuries, and the emotional trauma of watching Tyson arrested for trying to help him had pushed his aging body beyond its limits. What about reducing the stress? Dr. Nguyen continued. Perhaps stepping back from this legal situation, focusing on your health? Can't do that, Doc, Frank replied quietly. Too many people counting on me now. But even Frank's determination couldn't mask the growing cracks in their movement. The community support that had seemed so solid 3 weeks ago was beginning to fracture under pressure. People who had bravely testified were receiving anonymous threats. Small businesses that had supported the cause found themselves subjected to increased police scrutiny and mysterious code violations. Detective Romano delivered the latest bad news during a carefully arranged meeting in the back room of Dolores Murphy's diner. Her face carried the exhaustion of someone fighting a war on multiple fronts. 3 more witnesses have recanted their statements, she reported grimly. Maria Santos says she was mistaken about what her nephew told her. Jerome Williams now claims his arrest was justified. Even some of the people from the community meeting are backing away. Frank absorbed this information with the stoicism of a soldier who'd learned that retreat was sometimes inevitable. What about the federal investigation? Still ongoing, but without local support, it's becoming harder to build cases. Torino's people are good at making evidence disappear and witnesses develop amnesia. Outside the diner's windows, the neighborhood that had buzzed with hope and determination now felt subdued. People hurried past without making eye contact, fear once again dominating their interactions with the world around them. He's winning, Frank said quietly to Romano's jaw tightened. Not yet, but we're running out of time and options. Captain Vincent Torino's office had never felt more like a throne room. Behind his polished desk, surrounded by commendations and photographs with political figures, he radiated the confidence of a man who'd just defeated his most dangerous opponent. The meeting with his inner circle felt more like a victory celebration than a strategy session. The Tyson situation is contained, he told officers Kowalski and Brennan, both of whom bore fading bruises from their encounter with the champion. Federal prosecutors are confident of conviction, and his legal team is already discussing plea bargains. Kowalski, his jaw still tender from Tyson's uppercut, smiled with vindictive satisfaction. What about the old man? Washington still running his mouth to reporters. Let him talk, Torino replied dismissively. Without Tyson's celebrity status, he's just another bitter old man making unsubstantiated accusations. The media has already moved on to other stories. Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Unlike his partner, he'd found little satisfaction in their apparent victory. Something about the systematic destruction of evidence and intimidation of witnesses sat wrong with him, though he lacked the courage to voice his concerns. What's our next move? Kowalski asked. Torino leaned back in his leather chair, his cold, blue eyes reflecting decades of successfully navigating corrupt systems. We continue business as usual. This neighborhood has learned what happens when people challenge legitimate authority. I expect complaints will decrease significantly. The captain was right. Police activity in the area had returned to previous patterns of aggressive stops and intimidating behavior, but community resistance had virtually disappeared. People who had spoken out found themselves targets of increased attention, their daily lives subjected to scrutiny that made normal existence difficult. Frank Washington's house had become a lonely fortress. Former supporters no longer visited, afraid of guilt by association. The phone calls of encouragement had stopped, replaced by dial tones and silence. Even some family members had begun suggesting he should accept defeat and focus on his health. The isolation was taking its toll. Frank's appetite had disappeared, and sleep came in brief, troubled intervals interrupted by nightmares about Marcus and fears for Tyson's fate. The weight he'd lost since the beating made his clothes hang loose on his frame, giving him the appearance of a man whose spirit was slowly breaking. During his darkest moments, sitting alone in his living room surrounded by case files that seemed increasingly pointless, Frank questioned whether their fight had accomplished anything besides making their enemies stronger. The system had absorbed their best punch and emerged more entrenched than before. Detective Romano's visits became less frequent as the federal investigation stalled. Without new evidence or cooperative witnesses, even her determination was being ground down by bureaucratic inertia and political pressure. The promising leads that had seemed so solid weeks earlier were evaporating under sustained assault from Torino's network. But unknown to his enemies, Frank Washington had not surrendered. Despite his failing health and apparent isolation, the old soldier was preparing one final mission, a desperate gambit that would either destroy the corruption network or cost him everything he had left, in the pre-dawn darkness of his bedroom. Frank opened a small electronic device that Detective Romano had entrusted to him weeks earlier. The digital recorder was no bigger than a matchbox, but it held the power to either vindicate their cause or sign his death warrant. Sometimes, Frank whispered to himself, echoing words he'd spoken in Vietnam firefights, an old soldier has, to go on one more mission. The recording device felt heavier than its actual weight as Frank Washington prepared for what might be his final mission. Detective Romano had provided the wire 3 weeks earlier, during the height of their momentum, when the plan had seemed like simple insurance rather than a desperate last resort. "You sure about this?" Romano had asked when she'd fitted the nearly invisible transmitter inside Frank's jacket. "If Torino discovers your recording, there's no telling what he might do." Frank had accepted the risk then, and he was prepared to follow through now, even with his health deteriorating and his support network scattered. The old soldier understood that sometimes victory required sacrifices that would never appear in official reports. The opportunity came during a chance encounter outside Martinez Corner Market, the same store where Frank had been shopping when Kowalski and Brennan first targeted him. Captain Torino emerged from an unmarked patrol car, his presence in the neighborhood clearly intended as a message of dominance. "Mr. Washington," Torino called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. "How are you feeling? I heard you've been having some health problems." Frank steadied himself against his walking cane, the recording device activated with a subtle touch to his jacket button. "I'm managing, Captain." "Good to hear." Torino approached with predatory confidence, apparently unable to resist gloating over his victory. "I wanted to personally apologize for the unfortunate misunderstanding with my officers. Sometimes situations escalate beyond anyone's intentions." "Misunderstanding." Frank kept his voice level despite the rage building in his chest. "Well, we both know what really happened," Torino said, moving closer and lowering his voice. "Your friend Tyson assaulted 2 police officers, and you've been spreading lies about excessive force. But I'm a reasonable man, willing to let bygones be bygones." The captain's arrogance was revealing itself more completely as he sensed total victory. Frank encouraged the monologue with carefully placed questions, drawing out admissions that would have horrified even Torino's supporters. "The thing is," Torino continued, apparently enjoying the opportunity to explain his superiority, "this neighborhood needs to understand how things work. Some people require firmer guidance than others, and my officers provide that guidance. When necessary, like with my son Marcus." Frank's voice carried just enough challenge to keep Torino talking without raising suspicion. "Your son was a perfect example of what happens when people don't learn their lessons," Torino replied callously. "We tried to educate him about respecting authority, but he insisted on being difficult. Sometimes examples have to be made." Frank's hand trembled slightly on his cane, but he forced himself to remain calm. The captain was essentially confessing to murder, but only if Frank could keep him talking long enough to provide details that would be legally useful. "The hanging was a nice touch," Torino added with chilling casualness. "Made everything look like personal failure rather than community correction. My boys did good work that night." The admission hit Frank like a physical blow, but years of military training helped him maintain his composure. Marcus hadn't committed suicide. He'd been murdered, just as Frank had always suspected. And now he had proof. Captain Torino seemed intoxicated by his own power, continuing his confession with the casual cruelty of a man who believed himself untouchable. Frank encouraged him with subtle questions, his military experience helping him extract maximum intelligence from an overconfident enemy. "The beauty of the system," Torino explained, "is that it protects those who understand how to work within it. Judges who owe favors, prosecutors who need political support, media contacts who know which stories to bury. It's all about relationships." What about internal affairs investigations? Frank asked, hoping to draw out specifics about the cover-ups. Torino laughed coldly. Internal affairs? Half those investigators used to work for me. The other half know better than to bite the hand that feeds them. When complaints come in, they get lost in paperwork or witnesses suddenly develop memory problems. Like the video evidence from my beating, that was particularly satisfying, Torino admitted with obvious pride. Professional work, coordinated at multiple levels. Your friend Tyson never stood a chance once we decided to shut him down. Frank's recording device captured every word as Torino detailed the systematic destruction of evidence and intimidation of witnesses. The captain revealed the names of accomplices in other departments, described methods for silencing victims, and boasted about similar operations in neighboring precincts. The federal investigation doesn't worry you? Frank pressed, knowing this might be his only chance to gather comprehensive evidence. Federal investigators need local cooperation, Torino replied dismissively. Without witnesses and evidence, they're just spinning their wheels. Besides, I've got friends in federal law enforcement too. People who understand that maintaining order sometimes requires flexibility in how we interpret rules. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Torino becoming increasingly specific about his network's operations. He described financial arrangements with political figures, detailed plans for expanding control to other neighborhoods, and revealed contingency plans for dealing with future challengers. Frank felt simultaneously thrilled and terrified by what he was capturing. This evidence could destroy Torino's entire network, but if the captain discovered the recording, Frank's life would be forfeit within hours. I should get going, Frank said finally, sensing that Torino was beginning to wind down his monologue. Of course, Torino replied, his demeanor shifting back to false civility. Take care of your health, Mr. Washington. It would be terrible if something happened to you. The threat was unmistakable, but Frank simply nodded and began walking slowly toward his house. Behind him, he could hear Torino getting back into his patrol car, apparently satisfied with his demonstration of power. Once inside his house with the door securely locked, Frank removed the recording device with shaking hands. The small digital display showed 43 minutes of conversation, including admissions that would send Torino and his accomplices to federal prison for decades. But Frank also understood the danger he now faced. If Torino suspected what had happened, the old soldier's life expectancy could be measured in hours rather than years. This evidence had to reach Detective Romano immediately, before anyone discovered what he'd accomplished. With trembling fingers, Frank dialed Romano's secure number, knowing that this call would either save his community or sign his death warrant. Either way, his mission was complete. Marcus would finally have justice, and Mike Tyson would be vindicated. Sometimes that was enough for an old soldier to consider his duty fulfilled. Detective Romano's secure phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m., jolting her from uneasy sleep in her downtown apartment. Frank Washington's voice on the other end carried exhaustion mixed with grim triumph. I got him, Frank said simply. I got it all. 20 minutes later, Romano sat in Frank's dimly lit living room, listening to recordings that would reshape the entire case. Torino's voice filled the space with casual admissions of murder, evidence tampering, and systematic corruption that spanned decades. Jesus Christ, Frank, Romano whispered as the captain's confession about Marcus played through her headphones. This is everything we need. Frank slumped in his armchair, the effort of his final mission having drained what little strength remained in his aging body. He killed my boy, said it right to my face, like he was bragging about stepping on an ant. Romano's hands shook slightly as she handled the recording device. 43 minutes of evidence that would destroy Torino's network and vindicate everyone who'd suffered under their corruption. But she also understood the immediate danger Frank had placed himself in. We need to get you somewhere safe, she said. If Torino suspects what you've done, let him come, Frank interrupted quietly. I'm an old soldier, detective. I knew the risks when I accepted this mission. Romano studied the elderly veteran's face, seeing the same determined expression that had once carried him through Vietnamese jungles. Despite his frail appearance and deteriorating health, Franklin Washington remained a warrior. How fast can you move on this? Frank asked. Fast, Romano replied, already mentally organizing the raids that would be necessary. This evidence ties directly into our federal investigation. We can have arrest warrants within hours. She pulled out her encrypted phone and began making calls to FBI contacts who'd been waiting 2 years for exactly this kind of breakthrough. The recording provided probable cause for searches, arrests, and asset seizures that would dismantle the entire corruption network. There's something else, Frank said during a brief pause in Romano's phone calls. Torino mentioned other precincts, other neighborhoods. This goes way beyond what we suspected. Romano nodded grimly. The federal task force had suspected the corruption extended beyond the 5th precinct, but Torino's recorded admissions provided specific names and locations that would allow coordinated action across multiple jurisdictions that AS Dawn approached. Frank's house became an unofficial command center. FBI agents arrived in unmarked vehicles, setting up surveillance equipment and communication systems. Federal prosecutors reviewed the recordings and began preparing comprehensive indictments. Frank watched the activity with quiet satisfaction, though his body continued to betray the stress of recent weeks. Dr. Nguyen's warnings about his health seemed prophetic. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. "You did it, soldier," Romano told him during a brief, quiet moment. "Marcus is going to get justice." Frank nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on a framed photograph of his son. Sometimes that's all an old man can ask for, the chance to complete his mission. Outside, unmarked federal vehicles began positioning themselves throughout the city, preparing for the largest police corruption raid in Brooklyn's history. The raids began at exactly 5 a.m., coordinated across 17 locations throughout Brooklyn and Manhattan. Federal agents moved with military precision, executing search warrants signed by judges who'd been kept in the dark about the investigation until the final moment. Captain Vincent Torino's comfortable suburban home in Bay Ridge became ground zero for the operation. FBI agents surrounded the property before dawn, cutting off all escape routes and communication channels. When they breached the front door, they found Torino in his kitchen, calmly drinking coffee as if he'd been expecting them. Vincent Torino, lead agent Sarah Chun announced, displaying her badge and warrant. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder." Torino's composure cracked for the first time in decades as the weight of the charges hit him. The careful political connections and systematic cover-ups that had protected him suddenly seemed inadequate against federal evidence gathered over 2 years of investigation. Simultaneously, teams hit the homes and offices of 24 officers across multiple precincts. Randy Kowalski was arrested at his girlfriend's apartment in Queens, still drunk from the previous night's celebration. Dale Brennan surrendered quietly at his parents' house, his nervous breakdown finally complete. The evidence collected during the searches exceeded even Romano's expectations. Financial records revealed systematic bribery and extortion schemes. Communication logs showed coordination between corrupt officers and political figures. Most damning, they discovered detailed files on targeted citizens, including surveillance photos and personal information used for harassment campaigns. By noon, local news stations were broadcasting footage of handcuffed officers being led into federal buildings. The same media outlets that had questioned Frank Washington's credibility now scrambled to understand the scope of the corruption network they'd failed to investigate. Mike Tyson's attorney received the call he'd been praying for at 2:17 p.m. All charges against his client were being dropped immediately, with federal prosecutors acknowledging that Tyson had been framed by the conspiracy they'd just dismantled. The champion's release from federal custody became a media spectacle rivaling his greatest victories. Dozens of reporters and supporters gathered outside the detention facility as Tyson emerged, his dignity intact despite 3 weeks of imprisonment. "Justice took its time," Tyson said simply when asked for comment. But it showed up when it mattered. Frank Washington watched the coverage from his hospital bed, where exhaustion and stress had finally overwhelmed his aging body. The recordings had cost him the last reserves of his strength, but the sight of Tyson walking free made every sacrifice worthwhile. Detective Romano visited that evening, her exhaustion evident, but her satisfaction complete. The federal task force had achieved more in one day than local investigations had accomplished in decades. "Torino's already trying to cut a deal," she reported. offering to testify against political connections in exchange for reduced charges. Frank's smile was weak but genuine. Let him talk. After 3 years of silence, I want to hear everything he has to say. Outside Frank's hospital window, the Brooklyn neighborhood that had lived in fear for so long began to feel the first stirrings of genuine hope. Police cars still patrolled the streets, but their occupants carried themselves differently, with accountability rather than impunity guiding their actions. The system hadn't been destroyed, but it had been reminded that justice, though delayed, could still arrive with devastating force when righteous people refused to surrender. 6 months later, the Brooklyn courthouse steps buzzed with activity as Frank Washington prepared to address the largest police reform ceremony in the city's history. The elderly veteran stood without assistance, his health restored through proper medical care, and the peace that came with justice finally served. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the frail, beaten man who'd been assaulted outside Martinez Corner Market. In his place stood a dignified advocate whose courage had sparked systematic change throughout New York's law enforcement community. "Ladies and gentlemen," Frank began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd of reporters, community leaders, and reformed police officers. 6 months ago, I was just another old man that bad cops thought they could intimidate into silence. Mayor Patricia Williams sat in the front row beside Police Commissioner Janet Rodriguez, both appointed after their predecessors resigned in the wake of the corruption scandals. The new leadership had embraced reform rather than fighting it, understanding that public trust required transparency and accountability. "My son Marcus died because I couldn't protect him from a corrupt system," Frank continued. "But his death wasn't meaningless if it helps prevent other families from experiencing the same loss." In the audience, Detective Romano, now Deputy Commissioner for Internal Affairs, watched with pride as the man she'd helped wire for his dangerous mission delivered a speech that would be quoted in police academies for years to come. Mike Tyson stood near the back of the crowd, his presence still commanding attention despite his efforts to remain inconspicuous. The community center bearing Marcus Washington's name had become his primary focus, providing after-school programs and mentorship for neighborhood youth who might otherwise fall victim to the streets. "Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty," Frank said, his eyes finding Tyson in the crowd. "It's about good people having the courage to stand up when they witness wrongdoing. Sometimes that means risking everything you have for principles you believe in." The ceremony honored not just Frank's courage, but the dozens of community members who'd found their voices during the investigation. Maria Santos had been appointed to the new Civilian Oversight Board. Jerome Williams was completing his law degree with plans to become a civil rights attorney. Even Mrs. Chun had become an advocate for immigrant rights within the reformed police community. Captain Vincent Torino's cooperation had led to indictments spanning 5 precincts and reaching into city government. 12 officers received federal prison sentences, while political figures faced their own reckoning with voters who'd learned about their complicity in systematic corruption. Randy Kowalski and Dale Brennan had both testified against their former captain in exchange for reduced sentences. Kowalski received 8 years in federal prison, while Brennan's cooperation and obvious remorse earned him 5 years with mandatory community service upon release. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Frank concluded his speech. "But when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice, extraordinary things become possible." The applause lasted nearly 5 minutes, with standing ovations from community members who'd lived through decades of fear and intimidation. Frank Washington had become more than a victim seeking justice. He'd become a symbol of what citizens could accomplish when they refused to surrender their dignity to corrupt authority. As the ceremony concluded, Tyson approached the podium where Frank was accepting congratulations from reformed police officials and community leaders. "How you feeling, soldier?" Tyson asked quietly. Frank's smile carried peace that had been absent for 3 years. "Like my mission's finally complete, champ. Marcus would be proud of what we accomplished." They stood together for a moment, the legendary boxer and the decorated veteran, watching a community that had rediscovered its voice and its power. The morning sun filtered through the familiar windows of Mel's Diner as Mike Tyson settled into his corner booth with a cup of coffee and the day's newspaper. The headlines told a story of continued reform. Police Oversight Board reports 90% reduction in excessive force complaints, and community policing initiative expands to 5 additional precincts. Dolores Murphy approached with the coffee pot, her smile genuine and warm. The diner had become something of a landmark since the corruption scandal broke, with reporters and visitors making pilgrimages to see where the legendary boxer had planned his intervention in local injustice. "The usual, hon?" she asked, though they both knew Tyson's order by heart. "Thanks, Miss Dolores." His voice carried the same quiet authority it always had, but there was a contentment now that hadn't been present during those tense early days. The neighborhood outside had transformed dramatically. Children walked to school without fear. Elderly residents moved freely through streets where they'd once hurried past in anxiety. Police officers still patrolled, but their interactions with citizens reflected training in de-escalation and community engagement rather than intimidation. Frank Washington appeared in the diner's doorway, moving with the careful but confident steps of a man whose health had been restored along with his faith in justice. At 74, he carried himself with the dignity of someone who'd completed his most important mission. "Mind if I join you?" Frank asked, approaching Tyson's booth. "Always room for a war hero," Tyson replied, gesturing to the opposite seat. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, two men who'd shared an extraordinary battle and emerged victorious. The Marcus Washington Community Center was thriving under Tyson's guidance. While Frank had become a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences across the country, a young man in his early 20s approached their table hesitantly, recognition evident in his eyes. He was well-dressed, but nervous, clearly gathering courage for something important. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Are you Mike Tyson?" "That's right, son. What can I do for you?" The young man glanced around, then leaned closer. "There's this guy at my job, supervisor who thinks he can push people around because of his position. Makes racist comments, threatens people who complain. I keep thinking someone should stand up to him, but..." Tyson studied the young man's face, seeing the same combination of fear and moral determination that had driven Frank Washington to document police corruption for 3 years. "What's your name?" Tyson asked. "Kevin. Kevin Roberts." "Well, Kevin Roberts," Tyson said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned that real strength came from protecting others. "Sometimes you just gotta have the heart of a champion. And champions always protect those who can't protect themselves." Frank nodded approvingly. "The champion's right, son. Sometimes standing up to bullies is the most important thing you'll ever do." Kevin straightened slightly, drawing strength from their words. "What if I'm not strong enough? What if he tries to get me fired?" Tyson's smile was warm but determined. "Strength isn't just about muscles, kid. It's about knowing right from wrong and having the courage to act on it. You document everything, you find allies, and you never back down from what's right. And remember," Frank added, "you're not fighting alone. Good people will stand with you when you stand for justice." As Kevin thanked them and left the diner with renewed purpose, Tyson and Frank returned to their newspapers and coffee. Outside the windows, their neighborhood continued its daily routine, transformed from a place of fear into a community where ordinary citizens could trust that justice would prevail. "Think we made a difference?" Frank asked. Tyson folded his newspaper and looked out at the street where he'd once watched an elderly veteran being brutalized by corrupt officers. Children played safely on sidewalks. Residents chatted with police officers who'd earned their respect, and the sense of community that had been crushed under systematic oppression was flourishing again. "Yeah, soldier," Tyson said quietly. "I think we did just fine. If you liked the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.